In a quiet Dublin suburb, a man runs towards a burning house. Smoke and flames push him back, but he persists. Startled neighbours try to grab him. He is screaming and shouting. His voice is hoarse from smoke billowing through an open door. "Get them out," he cries. "Please get them out." Someone begins to raise a ladder to a window. The man spots his chance and makes a grab for one of the rungs. He is tall, lean and athletic. He can do this. He can save his wife and child. His fingertips slip from the rungs as others pull him back. "It's too dangerous," they warn him. In a blind panic, he collapses onto the grass. He is a respectable husband. He is a president of a swimming club. He has his own successful pub. He has a beautiful wife and child. He has a happy family. Neighbours look on, unable to comfort him. His house is up in flames, his family still inside. Their hearts break for him. His name is Frank McCann. He stands there with his world falling apart, in front of all those people watching him crumble before them. Nobody there that terrible night could ever forget it. None of them could ever forget him. But there is much they don't know about Frank McCann. When someone is murdered in Ireland, the Gardaí call in a team of forensic scenes of crime examiners from the Technical Bureau. For 25 years, I was a part of that team. My name is John Sweetman. I was there to help read the silent and often hidden clues at a crime scene. I saw what killers tried to hide. Fingerprints unknowingly left behind. Murder weapons hidden in plain sight. Handwriting that betrayed a lie. Every detail told the real story. And now I'll tell you those stories. In this podcast from GoLoud, I take you inside some of Ireland's most haunting crimes. This is Lines of Enquiry, a GoLoud original podcast that looks beyond the headlines, following the evidence step by step and uncovering the stories behind the investigations. In this episode, the killing of Esther and Jessica McCann, a story of deception and a double life, where a dark secret led to a shocking and heartbreaking crime. Esther McCann was born Esther O'Brien on the 29th of March in 1956 and grew up in the seaside town of Tramore in County Waterford. Tramore in Irish means big beach, and that's just what Esther's childhood playground looked like, with 5 kilometres of shoreline on one side of her home on Talbot Place, with the lively bustle of Tramore town on the other. Esther was the youngest of 4 children. Her mother Bridget and father Joe O'Brien had wanted a second boy for Pat, their only son. Phyllis was their eldest, then Pat and Marion. Pat never got a brother. When Esther arrived, it was Marion, just 2 years older, who found a new best friend. Growing up, the pair were inseparable. Tramore was a safe community where nobody locked their doors. Unused keys sat in locks, rusty from the salty Atlantic breeze. The sisters couldn't have looked more different. Esther had an angelic face with huge brown eyes and soft brown hair. Marion had a head of wild red curls and a face of freckles. They were free-spirited and mischievous, regularly sneaking out of the house during summer months to watch the sunrise. They always made it home to their cold beds before their parents awoke. They loved music too. Van Morrison and Leonard Cohen were their favourites, and they would sing and hum songs as they wandered through town, arm in arm. From a young age, they discovered a way to get into gigs in local venues, and those stories would be regularly recalled and shared with others as adults. That time they saw Thin Lizzy perform at the Silver Slipper Ballroom, how they were so young at just 12 and 14 years of age, they had to stand on chairs to get a glimpse of the band, and how when they did, they fell around laughing as 6'1" Phil Lynott hit his head off overhead lights when he jumped. It was only natural, so, that Esther would follow her sister Marion to Dublin when she finished school. Marion had joined the civil service, and she had a house in Fearhouse with her new husband, Billy Leonard. Esther moved in with them 2 years later and began studying psychology in UCD, which she later dropped to become an early adopter of new computer systems, like word processing, a technology largely unfamiliar in the Irish workplace. Esther's brother Pat also lived in the area with his family. They had built a new family unit outside of Tramore. And Esther was building one of her own. By the mid-1970s, she had fallen in love. She had big dreams for their future, but her world came crashing down in 1977 when her boyfriend was tragically killed in a motorcycle accident. Esther was grieving the loss of her first love. At just 22 years old, she was heartbroken. In those days after the accident, the family knew something was wrong. Esther was pale and withdrawn, and Bridget, her mother, worried that she was seriously ill. She worried her daughter might even have cancer. Esther had put it all down to her recent loss. But it was something else. Just days after the accident, Esther found out she was pregnant. Bridget had lost her husband Joe in 1973, and her children were everything to her. So, when she found out that Esther was pregnant, she was relieved and excited about a new grandchild. It was a progressive attitude for a time in Ireland when unmarried mothers were frowned upon by society, often banished to a Magdalen laundry or forced into an unhappy marriage to avoid any scandal. Bridget even bought a house for Esther in the South Dublin suburb of Talla, so she could have her own place for her and her child, just a 5-minute drive from her siblings, Marion and Pat. Esther gave birth to a baby girl on the 6th of January 1979. It wasn't the way she would have planned her life. She would have wanted to share this moment with her late boyfriend, the little girl's father. But Esther knew, as soon as her baby arrived, that this was what she was meant to be, a loving mother. Esther, Marion, and the entire family doted on the new addition to their growing family. She was loved. She would always be loved. And then, the unthinkable happened. At just 6 weeks old, the little girl died of a cot death. The most terrifying, sudden and unexplained death. Esther's world crumbled around her. For a second time. Every day from then on, her little baby was in her heart and mind. It was several years later, in 1985, when Esther found love again, with a man called Paul. The pair had been together for 5 years, and everyone around them seemed to assume they would marry. But Paul wasn't from a big, close-knit family like Esther, and he had other plans in life. He wanted to move to Australia. He wanted Esther to leave too. They could start a new life together, he told her. They could begin a new chapter. Esther couldn't go. She just couldn't imagine a life without her family. Nothing was as big or as important to her as family. She was heartbroken when Paul left, but couldn't follow him. By 1986, Esther was working as a banquet coordinator and office manager in Dublin's Shelbourne Hotel, one of the city's most elegant and prestigious hotels. She found the work exciting as she got to plan glamorous events for wealthy guests. Esther was a social butterfly, and she was good with people. The work suited her natural talents, and she was liked by those she worked with. For all the heartache she had endured, and by now still just 29 years old, Esther was also still a hopeless romantic. She loved going out, whether it was with Marion and Billy to a local pub, or after-work drinks with colleagues around Grafton Street, drinking pints of Guinness, smoking, laughing and talking late into the night. Friends brought friends, and Esther quickly became the heart of every gathering. She was warm, funny, outgoing, and effortlessly charming. And she was single. All her attributes had captured the eyes of one suitor in particular. He was a friend of a friend who would tag along to pub crawls, but could never quite fit in. He was quiet and reserved. He dressed conservatively compared to Esther's pals, with their bright clothes and latest fashion trends. He didn't smoke or drink, and yet he stayed on into the small hours for those long drunken evenings in Dublin's smoky pubs. He wanted to be introduced to the woman with the big brown eyes and infectious smile. When the large group of friends gathered in the Shelbourne Hotel for a night out in January 1986, Esther found herself sitting beside Frank McCann. He was tall, lean, and a sensible dresser. He sported what might be called a severe haircut, and he wore steel-rimmed glasses. He wasn't the type of man she would usually be attracted to. He was serious, but he was interesting. At just 25 years of age, 4 years younger than Esther, he already had his own business. He was an apprentice cooper, an ancient craft that dated back to 1501, making wooden kegs used in the brewing and distillery of alcohol. When they first met, after he finally caught her attention, Frank might have told Esther of how he could trace the craft back to his great-great-grandfather, or told her how the Irish Times had written an article about his new company, Irish Craft Coopers, which operated out of Greenhills Industrial Estate in Walkinstown, near where he grew up. When Irish distillers made 24 people redundant in November 1982, Frank and another worker, Seamus Dunn, decided there were other uses for these wooden kegs, like flour containers or furniture. He was all at once a man of centuries-old tradition and an innovator. He was interesting, if not necessarily her usual type. Frank probably relayed all of this to Esther that night in one way or another. He probably told her how much he loved swimming too, and how he had once even represented Ireland at international competitions. He was coaching children at his former school, Terenure College, and he was a member of the Leinster branch of the Irish Amateur Swimming Association. And he probably told her he was a family man at heart. He still lived with his parents, Joan and Francis, and had 3 brothers and a sister. Soon, Esther's sister Marion watched the romance blossom between the unlikely couple. From that first night in January, Frank was always around. Esther's family accepted him, but there was always a sense that the relationship wouldn't last. The pair were simply far too different. Esther, the social butterfly, the woman at the centre of fun at every party, and Frank, the sensible, serious man, mature beyond his years. But somehow, Esther was falling for him. She told Marion she thought Frank was the perfect man. He was hard-working, ambitious, and he was mad about her. Soon enough, marriage seemed inevitable. Esther even told Frank and his mother about the death of her baby girl, her most closely guarded pain, because she believed there should be no secrets going into a marriage. Esther was a mother once. She had a beautiful child. She told Frank she wanted that again, with him. The couple bought a house on Butterfield Avenue in Rathfarnham, which Frank set about renovating with his father. The 3-bedroom house had a separate bathroom and toilet, which Frank made into one large room. The kitchen was too small, so he built an extension. He renovated the attic into a kind of private room for himself, a place Esther rarely entered. To Esther's family, the O'Briens, Frank was a devoted boyfriend. His efforts to make the perfect house for Esther, and his endless attention towards her, convinced him that she had a man who would look after her. 14 months after they met, in May 1987, Esther and Frank were married. Marion remembers 2 things from that day. Esther looked like a porcelain doll in her wedding dress, and Frank changed. He was already a respected swimming coach and businessman. Now he was also a husband, a family man, a pillar of society. That was Frank, on the surface at least. After they made their vows, there were changes. He became colder, Marion thought. Frank wasn't around as much as he used to be, whether at home with Esther or meeting up with her close siblings, his new extended family. In the aftermath of the wedding, he immediately stopped joining them when they met up for drinks or gathered at each other's homes. He had always tried to be there before. He wasn't as attentive to Esther either. He told Esther that he wasn't happy about Marion having a key to their home. She had one to let herself in when visiting her sister. This was how Esther and Marion had always done things. Family was family, and that meant the door was always open, and visits from a sister were always welcomed. This had been their way the entire time Esther was with Frank. But after the wedding, he put a sudden halt to it, ending Marion's right to visit at will. Esther and Marion soon realised the work Frank carried out on the house before they married wasn't the first steps on a grand plan of renovation. No, it soon became apparent that this was all the work he planned to do. And he was done. He wasn't even planning to finish the jobs he had started. He downed tools, and his work and swimming dominated his time. The sisters tackled the unfinished jobs as Marion made curtains for the house. Esther told her she could live in a tent with someone she loved. In the early years of their marriage, Esther filled the house with life. She had a potting shed where she grew seeds, a vegetable patch anchored by a pear tree, and a deep belief that, as she would say, if you plant with love, it grows. She had inherited her mother's green thumb and loved the colour and scent of the plants, and she loved nurturing living things. Her new neighbour, May Warner, had a beautiful quince tree in her front garden, and Esther was excited to get a cutting and try and grow her own one. 2 years into the marriage, Esther still had not become pregnant. She wanted children to fill their empty house. By now, her siblings Pat and Marion had their own families, and while she adored her nieces and nephews, she wanted her own babies with Frank. She had waited so long, since that heartbreak as a young woman. But with her marriage to Frank, she had hoped her wait was coming to an end. Her energy levels were low, and a trip to the GP found she had thyroid problems. Esther stopped working full-time in 1989 to try and get better. But family members weren't buying this as the only reason for the lack of children. Esther had confided in Marion that Frank wasn't interested in sex or having an adult relationship with her. Esther wanted them to try couples counselling, but Frank wouldn't go. Esther was stuck. Her great new beginning had begun to look like it had been a false start. On the surface, Frank appeared to be thriving. His business was doing well, and his influence within swimming circles grew rapidly. He was now fully embedded in an elite swimming network. His closest associates included George Gibney, the Irish Olympic swimming coach, and Derry O'Rourke, Gibney's eventual successor. They visited the home often, sitting with Frank in the small breakfast room between the kitchen and hall, huddled together and speaking in hushed tones. Whenever Esther or Marion entered the kitchen, the conversation stopped. The men barely acknowledged them. Marion found the men cold, arrogant, and rude. In 1990, Frank's sister Jeanette became pregnant at 17. It was unplanned, and she was still at school. Esther and Jeanette were already close, so when Frank's mother found it difficult to accept what had happened, Esther offered her sister-in-law a room and took on the duties of taking Jeanette to medical appointments, making sure she ate properly and caring for the young girl. She loved Jeanette, and during Jeanette's pregnancy, Esther considered fostering the baby. It was something Jeanette thought might be best for her child. Marion worried Esther would end up as a glorified babysitter. Like Esther, Jessica Mary McCann was born in March. Esther had always dreamed of a daughter called Mary. She celebrated the new arrival, making sure everyone knew about it, and visiting Jeanette and Jessica in hospital. While there, she spoke with a social worker attached to the hospital. They discussed the idea of Esther and Frank fostering baby Jessica. After a lengthy chat, the social worker said they should meet again the following day, with Jeanette present too, to discuss it some more and look into them fostering for 6 to 8 weeks. At that meeting, Jeanette said she had made up her mind. She wanted baby Jessica to go home from the hospital with Esther and Frank. She wanted them to adopt her child. Esther was thrilled, and on the surface Frank seemed delighted too. They worried Jeanette was rushing into her decision, but she assured them that she felt it was the best possible decision for her child, and she was sure they'd make great parents. And so, baby Jessica left the hospital with Esther and Frank to start her life. Esther was already madly in love. At 36 years old, and 14 years after that heartbreaking loss that had shadowed her every day since then, Esther had a second child. She had the family she had wanted so deeply and for so long. It was what she had dreamed of all those years. What she couldn't have realised then was that those few days and that decision was the beginning of something much darker. That it was the start of a chain reaction of events that would eventually lead to one of Ireland's most infamous crimes. Esther McCann felt complete. With Jessica's arrival, her husband and she were finally a proper family unit. The house at Butterfield Avenue was filled with joy and excitement as family and friends popped in to see the new baby and toast her happy parents. Esther and Marion decorated the small box room and hung pink fluffy mobiles from the ceiling. It was the perfect little room for a precious little girl. Esther had her days filled with caring for Jessica. It was a full-time job, but she was committed to other things too. Things like fundraising and giving free computer classes to young women. She had helped raise £20,000 for a friend's child with cerebral palsy, called the Conor Farrelly Trust Fund, to send the child to a groundbreaking treatment centre in Hungary. One of the women who took her classes said, while Esther was warm and caring, she was always careful in how she spoke about Frank. The woman sensed he was the one who set the rules in the house, even when it came to Jessica. Esther had to smoke in the back garden too, because Frank had banned smoking in the house, which was unusual for the time. By 1991, he was president of the Leinster branch of the Irish Amateur Swimming Organisation, and chaperone and manager to the Irish swimming team going to international competitions in Rome, Paris and the US. He had a photograph in a family album of one trip where he stood beside Michelle Smith, a young Irish swimmer who would go on to win 3 gold medals in the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta, before being banned from competing for 4 years over allegedly tampering with an anti-doping sample. Frank was a tough coach. He wouldn't tolerate bad language and would impose bans on swimmers who used it. With his coaching counterparts, George Gibney and Derry O'Rourke, they had full control of how the Irish Amateur Swimming Organisation was run. If a swimmer stepped out of line, they were made an example of, sitting out important competitions and team events. But there were sinister and unsettling rumours circulating in this tight-knit swimming circle. But Esther had another worry. Marion's eldest son, James, had been diagnosed with bone cancer. Esther was so close to him and his siblings, Brian and Esther, known as Little Esther, and their time was taken up with hospital appointments, minding the children, and comforting each other over cups of tea. In April of 1992, a call was made to the adoption board, the body handling Esther and Frank's application to adopt baby Jessica. That caller had something to tell the adoption board, something about Frank McCann. It was something pressing, something that they felt should disqualify Frank from adopting any child. It was something that would have far-reaching consequences. All of the extended family were in love with Jessica. They all badly wanted her adoption to be settled, so that they would know she was a permanent part of the family. They were unaware of this call made to the adoption board, or the allegations made about Frank. For Esther and her siblings, and their children, their hope was it would only be a matter of time before the legal process concluded, and Jessica legally became Frank and Esther's daughter. All the cousins would play with Jessica at Butterfield Avenue. Esther was into painting at the time, and little Esther would wander around the house looking at all the pictures. She was so proud of her auntie, the artist. Their Uncle Frank wasn't around very much and didn't pay them much attention when he was there. He was not popular with his nieces and nephews. Esther's nephew Thomas saw Frank as a creep and someone who thought he was better than Esther's family. Perhaps being cold and distant with his nieces and nephews cast him in a villainous role. Whatever it was, Pat's daughter didn't like him. She told her father that he gave her the creeps. She would say, "Uncle Frank's a pervert." Little Esther didn't like him either. He had taught her to swim, an experience that should be fun and exciting. Instead, she found him disengaged and disinterested. He wasn't bothered about her enjoying herself. By the summer of 1992, There was still no word from the adoption board, and Esther was losing her patience. She wanted Frank to find out once and for all why they were still waiting. She would go and ask for herself if she had to put an end to this bureaucratic nonsense. On July 28 of 1992, the adoption board contacted the solicitor for Frank and Esther. They told him they would not be approving the adoption. There had been allegations credible enough that they did not feel Frank was a suitable parent. They informed the solicitor of what those allegations were. They asked him to inform Esther and Frank and to reply to them in a month. That summer, a series of extraordinary events started to happen at the McCann home. It started when Frank reported a gas leak to Bord Gáis. The leak was investigated, but nothing was found. A couple of weeks later, another leak was reported, this time at 10:53 a.m. When the Bord Gáis worker arrived, 20 minutes later, the outcome was very different. This time the fitter found a Class A leak, a serious danger that must be investigated properly. The leak was discovered in a pipe going into the house and was immediately fixed. Esther might have presumed this would be the end of the issue. A qualified expert had discovered the leak and remedied the problem. Less than 2 weeks after that, a family friend visited Esther in the evening. She noticed Esther was drowsy going to bed, and that she had barely said goodnight to her when she climbed up the stairs. The following morning, Esther woke up with a stabbing headache. The air of her bedroom felt heavy too. It was hard to breathe. It was like the smell of onions burning, and it was everywhere. She was immediately filled with panic. She had to get Jessica and get out of the house. With the little girl in her arms, she reached her car parked in their drive, but didn't start the engine. Esther knew this leak was serious. She couldn't risk turning on her car, so she let down the handbrake and pushed it out onto the street before driving away and calling Frank to tell him what had happened. She was rattled. She was a smoker. Even lighting a match would have caused a huge explosion. Once again, a Bord Gáis fitter arrived, and he found so much gas in the house that simply switching on a light switch could have caused an explosion. 2 gas joints had parted, he discovered. It could only have happened if heat had been applied to the joints, and as the gas meter at the house had only been upgraded a week earlier, there was no knowing what had happened. Esther was at her wits' end. On August 12th, she went to her doctor, explaining how she was lucky to be alive. What the doctor heard was chilling. The previous day, Esther had woken up in her bed, fully dressed, to the phone ringing. On her bed was an electric blanket that was normally kept in the spare room. It was carefully folded, and it was on fire. She managed to put the fire out. The phone that woke her was still ringing. It happened to be from Frank's pub, where an alarm was going off. Frank had come into the room as Esther was putting out the fire. He pulled the plug from the wall socket and brought the blanket outside. Esther was in tears as she recalled how, when she had gone to bed the night before, the blanket was not on her bed. She told her doctor how she felt she had flu in the days leading up to that incident. The doctor referred Esther to a psychiatrist at St. Vincent's Hospital. The appointment was set for the 21st of August. Esther confided in Flora, her sister-in-law, that there was another incident in her home. A mat drenched in chemicals lay on the floor beside her bed when she woke up one morning. She had no idea how it got there. Flora had told her there had to be a logical explanation, but she wondered, hadn't Frank been the only other one in the house? Strange things were happening to Frank too. He called into Rathfarnham Garda Station the day after Esther's visit to the doctor to report threatening phone calls to his home. His number was ex-directory, he told them, and the calls were upsetting his wife. That evening, he went to Blessington Garda Station near his pub to report an anonymous call he received there 2 weeks earlier. He also explained the unsettling calls to his home One of them was a mail caller who had mentioned the importance of insurance. He was baffled. Esther must have felt like the unluckiest person in the world. There were so many things going wrong, and there were more bizarre occurrences. The brakes on her car had failed while she was driving to Newlands Cross soon after. Her brother Pat was annoyed. Esther had just had the car serviced, so something like this should not have happened. He confronted the mechanic and asked if he was trying to kill his sister, but he told Pat that he hadn't touched the brakes. Like the gas incidents, it was just Esther and Jessica together when it happened. On the 25th of August, Frank visited Blessington Station. A call had come into the Cooperage pub at 12:15 a.m. the previous night. The caller said he knew Frank had spoken to the guards and referred to him and "that fucker across the road," which he took to mean Tim Grace of West Wicklow House Bar, another pub in the area. It transpired Grace was also getting strange calls. The threats increased. Frank called Blessington Garda Station again. On the night of the 31st of August, he asked for a Garda to come down to the pub. It was 11:05 p.m. When they arrived, Frank brought him to a yard at the back of his pub. There, on the wall, some letters had been painted. They read, "Burn, you bastard." By this time, Esther had seen a psychiatrist and explained how she had regular headaches and nosebleeds. She had a history of thyroid problems and she was feeling extremely depressed. But the psychiatrist didn't believe that Esther was depressed. He felt she was displaying symptoms of amnesia. On September 3rd, Frank spoke to a sergeant at the Garda station asking him to come to the pub because he had found something unusual. When the guard arrived, Frank told him he had found something in the phone book beside the name of his pub. Someone had scribbled "Burn." Beside the neighbouring pub's entry in the book was the word "bastard." On September 3rd, Bord Gáis tested the gas installation at Frank and Esther's house. They found no leak. Esther hoped this strange run of bad luck might be coming to an end. Esther could bring her attention back to Jessica, who was by then a healthy 18-month-old child who could hang onto walls and walk on wobbly legs around the house. She was growing bigger every day, and Esther couldn't wait to watch and document her every step for her. With all that had been going on, she hadn't managed to write anything in her diary since July 30th. "My darling daughter Jessica, you have grown and become a beautiful child. You have been walking now for a little over a week and have given up holding onto the walls in search of your own bit of independence. Cup of tea and up a daisy with constant talk of daddy, oh mammy, and mammy's baby." Esther made up her mind on those September days to get the adoption signed and sealed once and for all. She was unaware that there was an issue, that she and Frank would not be allowed to adopt. Frank knew, but Esther was still unaware. She decided she would find out for herself why a year and a half on she still hadn't heard from them. She called Marion, who was in Tramore with her family and staying with her mother-in-law. Esther told her she was going to have it out with Frank about these adoption delays. He knew how important it was to her. It couldn't be put off any longer. Marion begged Esther to wait until she was back in Dublin. Marion wouldn't be around if Esther was upset after she spoke to Frank. Esther made an appointment with the Coombe Hospital to meet the adoption workers herself. At around 8:30, Esther gave a computer class to Helen Palmer, one of her regular students. She left around 10 p.m. and Frank arrived home within the hour. Esther might have decided the next day to speak with Frank. She may have told him about her appointment the following week with the adoption board. She might even have been excited about the idea of taking charge of the matter and putting her case to them face to face and telling them that they were the perfect parents. Esther never made it to that meeting. Sometime around 1:35 a.m. or 1:40 a.m, Marie Daly, a neighbour who lived across the road from Frank, Esther and Jessica, woke to a loud bang. She got up and went to the street, where she saw a fire in the hallway of the McCann's home. The front door was open too. Other neighbours said the same. Richard Duggan, whose house was directly opposite the McCann's, was in bed when he heard what seemed like a car starting in a hurry, like a key turning too long in the ignition before speeding away. Then came the bang and the sound of breaking glass. A young group heading home from a wedding stopped their car when they saw the flames. They tried to get into an upstairs window by jumping on an adjoining garage to the house, but it was no use. The smoke and flames were too powerful. All of the windows on the house were closed. Even trying to break them was difficult. Mary Doyle, who lived next door to the McCanns, woke to a commotion outside and smelled smoke. With her husband Jimmy, they got their 5 children outside, for fear their own home would catch fire. When the fire brigade arrived, around 1:50 a.m, they too noticed the door was open. They could see the fire appeared to have started in the hall, and how the stairwell acted like a chimney, funneling heavy, thick plumes of smoke to the rooms above. The rooms where Esther and Jessica slept. Around 2 a.m, Frank returned home from the pub. He would have seen a group of his neighbours gathered on the street across from his house as he drove up. He would have seen the fire brigade. He would have watched his house going up in flames. Maybe even seen the first black plume of smoke in the night sky as he approached. As he pulled up, he ran from his car, screaming, "Get them out!" Neighbours grabbed him and held him back as he tried again to run towards the house. He was fainting and collapsing at the shock of what he was seeing. Neighbours could see his distress at not being able to reach his wife and child who were inside. Even surrounding streets could hear him. A neighbour, Ray Martin, had heard the initial explosion. It was followed by several smaller blasts. He then heard a man screaming. Ray knew then that the man's family were still inside. Wearing breathing apparatus, firefighters found the body of little Jessica in her cot. Esther was found on the landing, just outside Jessica's room. She had been trying to save her daughter. Esther and Jessica McCann were dead. Sometime after the fire, still in the early hours of Saturday, September 5th, Esther's brother Pat and his wife Flora heard knocking on their door. When Pat opened the door, he found Frank with his brother Bernard, Bernard's wife Sue, and their uncle Paddy. Frank told them Esther and Jessica were dead. Pat couldn't understand what was happening at first. He then looked at his brother-in-law and told him that he had done it. Pat didn't know why he had said that. Marion was at her mother-in-law's home in Tremor, who had answered the phone around 5 a.m. Marion heard cries and went to find out what had happened. Esther and Jessica had died in a house fire, she was told. The grief was unbearable. As she gathered her children together, Marion explained what had happened to their aunt and cousin. They cuddled and cried on the boys' beds. Other relatives and friends piled into the house as news started to spread around the town. Marion's cousin was a detective in the Gardaí, and when she spoke to him, she blurted out that Frank had done this. Frank had killed Esther and Jessica. Frank made a statement to Gardaí in those early hours of the morning. He told them that he had left the Cooperage pub between 1:20 a.m. and 1:30 a.m. and found his house on fire when he reached Rathfarnham. His interview with the Gardaí lasted 5 hours. In those 5 hours, Frank gave them many leads, many possible answers to the mystery of who would burn down his home with his wife and child inside. Gardaí looked into them. None made sense. That there were so many inevitably turned the investigating detectives' heads towards Frank. An examination of the house recovered Esther's computer and her hard drive. When Gardaí went to the house, they came across various items in the garden, like a gas cylinder that would be used in camping, and a blowtorch with a cylinder attached to it. Esther and Jessica's funeral on the 8th of September was held in Esther's childhood hometown of Tremor. Mother and child would be buried in the same coffin. Marion and Frank shared a car to Tremor. He had insisted everyone wear bright colours in honour of Esther's zest and enjoyment of life, but this didn't sit easy with Marion. Esther would never show up to a funeral like that. She would want to be respectful of the deceased. Marion's family all changed into black in the bathroom of a pub on the way to the church. There was a tradition in Tremor too that mourners would walk the hill leading up to the church behind the hearse. Frank told Marion he didn't want that. Again, the family went against his wishes and followed Esther and Jessica's coffin with a pair of Jessica's tiny shoes on top. A huge crowd turned out to pay their respects. Bach's Air on a G-string played throughout the church as the coffin was brought to the altar. Marion felt Frank was cold and distant. His behaviour seemed erratic. He hadn't told her if he would give a eulogy. He did in the end, reading a poem he had written. Later, friends of Esther would ask how he had found the time to write. During his speech, he said that Esther had another man in her life that deserved a mention. He left a long pause, and Marion wondered what Frank was referring to. After a time, Frank said he was talking about Connor Flynn, the little boy with cerebral palsy who Esther had raised money for. The way he said it, and the pause, didn't sit well with Marion. As he spoke in the church, a blind woman in the congregation listened. She remarked to someone beside her, "There is no sadness whatsoever in that voice." As the day went on, Frank's behaviour grew stranger. While driving up to a cousin's house later, Frank shouted to a group of young girls. Marion said his words sounded like, "I'm a free man," or he was here for the taking. At one point, she had to get something from his car, and when she opened the boot, his chain of office was sitting there. Marion found this odd. His chain of office was bestowed upon him as president of the Leinster branch of the Irish Amateur Swimming Association. To Frank, it was like a badge of honour, a status symbol that told the world he was an important player in Irish swimming circles. The chain always stayed in the hall. Why was it safely in the boot of the car now? Then there was a party Frank had planned for his mother's birthday in his Blessington pub. It had been planned long before the deaths of Esther and Jessica, for the evening of the funeral. Frank went ahead with the party. He even walked out with a birthday cake for his mother. Marion had initially felt sorrow for him, but as his behaviour continued to baffle, she started to grow increasingly suspicious of his actions. She too was speaking to the Gardaí. She started to learn that Frank had painted a far happier picture of their marriage than Marion was aware of. If he was to be believed, there were no problems, and he and Esther had had a very happy and healthy relationship. After the funeral, Frank took 2 holidays, one to the UK and one to the US. When he returned, he stayed with a friend, Emer Farrell. She was a neighbour. While there, on the 18th of September, Frank collapsed in the kitchen after receiving a mass card that was signed Rev Byrne. A few days later, Emer Farrell discovered another letter. This one had no address. She opened it and found another card with a newspaper clipping and the words, "Lack of pigs." By September 24th, the Gardaí had decided the fire at Frank and Esther's home was suspicious. It was no accident that had killed Esther and Jessica. What they didn't say was that Frank was a suspect. The canisters and cylinders recovered after the fire still haunted Gardaí. Detective Sergeant Seamus Quinn of the Garda Ballistics Section worked in the background to try and figure out how a fire of that magnitude could happen, even from a blowtorch aimed at a canister. Surely an accelerant of some kind would have been required too. Detective Sergeant Quinn carried out his own tests, but he never quite reached a satisfactory conclusion. Then, on November 4th, he witnessed an experiment carried out at the Civil Defence School in the Phoenix Park that showed a mammoth explosion could result from just a blowtorch and a canister. He spoke with fellow investigators on the case, the Gardaí who had interviewed Frank. By now they had uncovered information of their own. They had uncovered a possible motive. They had learned what the adoption board had learned, and what Esther was set to find out. Frank would never be allowed to adopt Jessica because he already was a father to a baby he would never be allowed to see. In 1986, he had had a sexual relationship with a swimming student. She was 17, with special needs. The baby was born 5 months after he married Esther. Frank had been taking advantage of a swimming student while he portrayed himself as the perfect match for Esther. The family of the young girl had the child adopted. Now, someone close to the family wanted the adoption board to know exactly what he had done. And that person had told them just 1 month after Jessica was born. For 14 months, the board had deliberated and their ruling was clear. There could be no adoption. On the advice of his solicitor, Frank had to tell Esther what was happening. He would have to explain how they came to their decision. He would have to share his secret. Unless there was another way. As the story of Frank McCann began to be laid bare, a disturbing pattern of incidents started to unfold before Esther's family's eyes. Frank had fathered a child. He had married their sister knowing that there was a baby that had been put up for adoption in a bizarre chain of events, mediated and handled by Father Michael Cleary. Cleary was one of the country's most popular priests, known as the singing priest. He told Frank, on behalf of the swimming student's parents, that the child would be adopted. Frank would have to pay money towards her medical costs. If he didn't, Esther McCann, his new wife, would find out all about Frank's antics, poolside. Frank posted the money in a letterbox at Mount Argus, where Cleary lived. It was 600 Irish pounds. On November 4th, 1992, Frank McCann was arrested at his pub at 1:25 p.m. 2 days later, on November 6th, he signed a statement admitting responsibility for starting the fire, though he claimed it was accidental. Gardaí found his statement confused, switching from the fire to the adoption crisis and the refusal that had been handed down by the adoption board. "I was going to finish it all. I was going to clean up the whole mess. Me, Esther and Jessica," his statement read. In another part, he admitted it was all his fault. He was the problem. Sometime after, he said he would do anything to get them back. After Frank's arrest, he admitted himself into John of God's, a Dublin hospital for mental health issues. While there, he met another patient and they decided to leave together, starting a new relationship and life in her mobile home in Waterford. They were already planning a life together, even though Esther and Jessica had died only 2 months before. Gardaí who arrested him found him working on the mobile home. He was even fitting pipework underneath. Frank's carefully constructed world was falling apart. His swimming associates, George Gibney and Derry O'Rourke, were about to be exposed as paedophiles for their parts in decades of sexual abuse in Irish swimming. The first official allegation against Gibney was lodged with Gardaí in December 1992. O'Rourke was jailed in 2024 for 10 years. Gibney was extradited back to Ireland last year after fleeing the country and faces around 50 charges of abuse. On the 11th of January 1994, Frank McCann's trial for murder of his wife and child got underway. By now, Frank was on his own. His family and Esther's wanted nothing more to do with him. His own mother had visited him to tell him she believed he was guilty. Gardaí were confident with their work. They had compiled enough evidence to show that Frank had carefully planned the murders from July 1992 until the house fire in September of that year. The repeated gas incidents and even the threats against his pub were all part of his scheme. The prosecution had harrowing evidence of what he had done to his wife and child. The court heard how the blaze that destroyed the house was a raging inferno. There were photographs that showed the charred body of baby Jessica. State pathologist Professor John Harbison told the Central Criminal Court how Jessica had a soother in her mouth when her blackened body was removed from the house. She had soot on her tongue, in the back of her throat, and in her air passages and lungs. Her mother had extensive burns on her body. Both had died from smoke inhalation. The prosecution argued over the course of the trial how Frank had hidden the secret about why they were not being allowed to adopt Jessica. Then, after 14 days, the trial ended abruptly on January 31st when Frank was deemed unfit to stand. He had tried to set fire to himself using a lighter and an aerosol can. It was almost 2 years later, in June 1996, when the second trial got underway. This time, Frank appeared more confident. He had been in Arbor Hill since the first trial collapsed, and he appeared keen to maintain a stony-faced demeanour. Sometimes he would slump down in his seat, but for the most part he was engaged. He interacted with his legal team, clenching and unclenching his fists as he instructed them. He read a murder mystery novel during lunch breaks, preferring to stay where he was rather than leave the court. The book was called Total Eclipse, which bore the tagline, "They were the perfect family until the perfect murder." He would hold the book up with its cover on display for all to see. He tried to show a human side to himself. At one point, the case had to be adjourned when Frank appeared to have a panic attack. While some in court were convinced, Marion wasn't buying it. She knew he was well used to seeing swimmers hyperventilating and would know how to replicate it perfectly. There was also a concern about how the jury might be swayed at one point. Frank had mentioned in his November 1992 statement to the Gardaí how on the night of the fire he had taken Jessica from her cot and played with her for a while, before gently putting her down for the night. Marion was furious. "I know what Jessica was like at the time. He'd never have gotten her down again." Frank was never the doting father, lavishing affection on his child, she said. On the 16th of August 1992, Frank McCann was sentenced to life for double murder. He had killed his wife and child. It was one of the longest murder trials in the history of the state, lasting 9 weeks after an investigation of 4 years. Frank McCann was 36 when a jury of 6 men and 6 women returned unanimous guilty verdicts after 8 hours for the murders of Esther and Jessica McCann. In the end, Frank had put his public image and social standing above the lives of his wife and child, and a very shocking scandal. He made sure that Esther would never know his dangerous secret. She would go to the grave not knowing what Frank had done. Esther's own mother believed her daughter would have been more understanding had he shared his dark past. The 83-year-old said Frank was too proud and couldn't have his image sullied in the world of swimming. So he killed his best friends, his only friends. Frank McCann has never won any of his parole hearings. His next one is due in March of 2026. He is allowed out on day release once a month and has earned a master's in computers while in jail. He created a profile for himself on LinkedIn in January 2023. He advertised himself as a problem solver and enthusiastic achiever when it came to his expertise in fixing computers. He wrote he had an engaging personality. He deleted the CV after the Irish Independent reported it. But for all his efforts to paint himself as somewhat reformed professionally, he has never said sorry for murdering his wife and child. He has never shown any remorse. He has never apologised to Esther's family for what he did to them. Frank's siblings and Esther's family are adamant that he needs to stay behind bars. In a live-line programme on RTE Radio 1 in March 2021, Marion called in to remind the public of what Frank had done all those years ago. He would be 61 that March, and she spoke on air and reminded the public of just how dangerous she believes Frank McCann remains. She told the story of how he had tried to murder her sister and niece on numerous occasions in 1992. The gas leaks, the electric blanket, the faulty brakes. She spoke of his deviousness and of his manipulative ways. She reminded people of how he had preyed on a young swimmer and rubbed shoulders with notorious paedophiles. She reminded people how they all watched out for each other, and how, in the end, his swimming persona meant more to him than the lives of his wife and child. He could not be disgraced publicly by a fall from grace, likely to come from Esther knowing why she would never adopt Jessica. Others who knew Frank also spoke on air. His brother Bernard was one. Bernard said his brother was, and still is, dangerous, that there was no redemption for him, that he should not get parole. "I hope he rots in there," he added. The following day, Elizabeth Shorten, Frank's sister-in-law, called into the show. She picked up where they had left off the previous day. She said Frank's ego was threatened by the adoption issue. If he was ever allowed to leave prison on parole, their families would spend their lives hoping he doesn't murder again. She said his mind is so twisted and so warped that he can think, to preserve his status, that he would kill his own wife and little adopted baby girl. We can't have somebody like that out in society. Thank you for listening to this episode of Lines of Enquiry. We have set up an Instagram page. If you're there, please give us a follow at Lines of Enquiry Podcast. We have an email address, linesofenquiry@goloudnow.com, and we would love to hear from you, so get in touch. Whether you have a story you think we should cover, or just want to let us know how you felt about an episode. That email is linesofenquiry@goloudnow.com. If you're enjoying the podcast, leaving a rating or review really helps. We've now passed 2,500 5-star ratings on Spotify, with a growing number of reviews on Apple Podcasts. Those responses make a real difference. They help new listeners find the series, and I am genuinely humbled by the response we've gotten. Thank you. Your support helps us to tell these stories. Make sure to like or follow the podcast in your podcast app, and hit the notifications button so you'll know every time a new episode is released. Lines of Enquiry is presented by me, John Sweetman. The podcast is created by Darren Cleary. Our executive producer is Eoin Brennan. Our producers are Siobhan Maguire and Siobhan Walsh. Sound editing and design is by Neil Kavanagh, with additional editing support from Ed Smith. This episode was written by Siobhan Maguire. The script editor was Eoin Brennan. Social media, marketing, video and legal support comes from the GoLoud team. In the end, everything done in the dark comes to light.